This is SOMA.
Let the only sound be the overflow. Pockets full of stones, lay me down. Let the only sound be the overflow.
Alright, context time. I've always been a little at odds with the horror gaming community's recent obsession with taking away all the power to fight back in horror games. It seemed like everyone thought the only way a horror game could be scary is if you went the Amnesia or Slenderman route. Which is why I was so glad last year when Alien Isolation released with combat and a far greater sense of risk because you had real resources to lose. Still, when I heard Frictional Games was working on another title, and it would be a science fiction setting inspired by BioShock and Alien, I was intrigued. Frictional have always been great at producing unique, dark adventures. Even if I haven't always been a fan of their game design, they've had stories compelling enough to make me want to venture further regardless. The more logical and realistic puzzles in their Penumbra series were also very intriguing and highly reminiscent of Silent Hill Shattered Memories, one of my favorite games on the Wii. So with all that considered, did SOMA meet my expectations? Surprisingly, yes! It met my expectations almost to a T, but that's both a good and a bad thing. The majority of the game's story and adventure game sequences are amazingly great, and well worth the price of admission. That said, I'm only going to touch briefly on the story to avoid spoiling any more than absolutely necessary, because really, this is not a story I want to spoil to you. You want to experience this for yourself. You play as Simon, a Canadian who just survived a car accident that killed his girlfriend and gave him potentially lethal brain damage. In a last-ditch attempt to save his life, he goes in for a brain scan at the hospital, and then suddenly wakes up in Pathos 2, an underwater research facility far in the future. The game's initial twists in relation to how you got here are very predictable, but thankfully the game gets past these first teasing story concepts and starts digging into the real story threads that have substantial substance. SOMA is as much a hardcore science fiction story as it is an adventure game, and it is refreshingly believable despite a few more fantastical sequences scattered throughout. The game touches upon a number of heady topics, like what it means to be alive, what happens when we start treating people's brains like computers, and is it better to accept death in the form we once were, or to live on in a new form? There's even some light morality choices, although it wasn't clear how they impacted my playthrough while I was playing. What really sells it all is how consistent the fiction is. The puzzles and morality questions aren't grafted into the gameplay, but instead make sense. One of the best puzzles to do this involves getting a proper simulation running to convince someone that they're still in normal reality. It's twisted, without needing an ounce of blood spilled, and really makes you think about what the game's talking about. Unfortunately, there is one problem with the story. The protagonist, Simon. If you are anything like me, then you will grow to detest Simon. He's supposed to be a standard fish-out-of-water archetype, but instead comes across as more just naive and stupid.
Look, we already know it can be done. We don't need to make it a big deal.
It is a big deal, Kath. It's a huge fucking deal. There's gotta be something else that can take us down there.
The Dunbat at Theta was the only vessel that could take that pressure, and you saw what happened.
Then think of something else.
He has to sometimes be explained the same concepts more than once that you, the player, have already grasped firmly before he even asks about them. He's childish, short-sighted, and sometimes downright draining with his negativity. Now, Frictional may have done this intentionally, given that other horror fiction often has characters you don't necessarily like. Even Silent Hill 2's James Sunderland was a protagonist some people found themselves not liking by the end of their game, for very understandable reasons. The only problem is, Simon only dies if you get a game over, unlike in a movie or a book where he'd likely be one of the first headed for the chopping block, excuse the pun. And not only are the rest of the cast more likable, but also have far more intriguing conversations to listen to. In particular, Catherine, another survivor on Pathos 2, is supposed to be the most socially inept member of the crew, and yet she practically dwarfs Simon in both her actor's performance, and is by far much more reasonable than Simon.
Huh? Wait, this isn't... Oh no! WoW got to the Dunbat before we did, am I right?
Well, it was talking. That's rarely a good sign.
There is a lot of pathos, once again excuse the pun, in some of these other performances as well, particularly when you hear two people lamenting at what could have been as their oxygen tanks run out.
No oxygen left. Better sit down. Don't want to fall into the abyss. There are worse ways to die. Probably. Why they call you Em?
Huh? Oh, it's for Emma.
Emma Alvaro. I like that. It's a good name. We should have hung out more. I think we would have made good friends.
Thanks. I would have liked that.
Finding out how their stories progress is one of the core aspects of SOMA that drives you to explore every corner of Pathos 2. You also really want to see whatever new puzzle the game has up its sleeve. Once again, I don't want to spoil much, but I can't deny that SOMA's refreshingly intuitive puzzle design is a welcome change to some more esoteric adventure game puzzles of yore. This isn't Myst, and for some, that might actually be a turnoff. But it's not as if the puzzles are simply dumbed down. There's a train of thought to each puzzle that makes them feel like real tasks. Optimizing space on a hard drive is something PC gamers in particular will be more than familiar with. Outside of an opening puzzle that relies more on guesswork than reasoning, and a few item-based puzzles that have you scouring levels for that one useful item you need, I can't think of a puzzle I didn't like. The added aspect of interactivity through Frictional's customary click and drag control system also works surprisingly well with the controller. In fact, I had no real problem playing with my Xbox One controller the entire game, save for a few computer menus that were a little difficult to navigate. The game also looks and sounds amazing. The visuals you're seeing in this recording are the game on low, and I've seen footage with it on maximum settings. SOMA is one of the prettiest indie games you could possibly be playing this year, with only a few awkward animations for human faces breaking the illusion. The inspiration by Ridley Scott's Alien is clear, but there's also a lot of sprinkles of System Shock throughout the experience. The underwater sections also take a note from Silent Hill and have an incredibly foggy and ominous atmosphere. The sound design is spectacular, with enough fine-tuning in the directional projection of the sounds that I could tell where enemies were without even having headphones on. SOMA just feels authentic, with most of its sound effects grounding the world and giving it just a little bit more texture to sell you on it a little bit more. Plus, if you bump something while sneaking around, its loudness and the sound varies by what material it's made of and how hard you hit it. That is fantastic attention to detail. You don't see that in some AAA games today. The soundtrack, however, is very limited, and while well done, it was hardly as memorable as the overall sound design. Unfortunately, like almost every horror title before it, SOMA didn't scare me once. If anything, I found the enemies more of a bothersome amount of work I had to sit through to get back to the genuinely good parts of the game. The problem is that SOMA relies way too much on old tactics that you have seen before. There's the monster that responds to loud noises, the monster you can't ever look at directly, the climax arc monster that just aggressively hounds you no matter what. If you've been playing horror games for a while, nothing here will surprise you. Instead of adding complexity and further deepening the situation and the mechanics, SOMA progressively takes your tools away from you and expects you to keep on surviving. This is all done to make you feel more helpless, but it does the opposite. It doesn't help that hiding in a darkened corner works against more than half the enemies, making them leave you alone. Or that you have a plentiful amount of checkpoints to always respawn at, or that health packs are easy to find. There's positively no risk or danger unless you run around smacking trash against every nearby surface. In fact, the tone of every monster encounter I was in was more a mixture of amusement and boredom, as the game tried to portray the monsters as terrifying threats, while I just made jokes at them and waited for them to move on so I could continue doing what I needed to do. I understand that Frictional took this direction with their games after fan feedback to the original Penumbra, but it's just disappointing to see them play it safe with their game design. It's possible to make a compelling horror game where you still try and defend yourself. I repeat, Alien Isolation did it fine, and I'm not saying that SOMA has to be Alien Isolation. In fact, it could be very different, and it could at least just throw a few new wrinkles on top of the mechanics it has. There was one section where I wished Catherine could have made noise over the loudspeaker to direct the monster to certain areas. That would have been cool, and it bugs me that those sorts of game design ideas aren't even explored here. Excuse the cliche turn of phrase, but really, variety is the spice of life, and SOMA would definitely benefit from expanded mechanics in its enemy encounters. When SOMA got me tense, it was usually when something wasn't actually endangering me. Yet that wasn't fear of the monster that got me tense, but fear I'd have to stop having fun and tolerate another meandering monstrosity. It got to the point where I could actually start to predict when the monster would come out, and I would just avoid that part of the level as long as I could. I realize I'm saying that the best part about a horror game is when it's not trying to be a horror game, but I can't deny that I feel Soma would be a much better game simply as a straight-up adventure title. Soma is an intriguing adventure game with great writing, enjoyable puzzle design, and fantastic atmosphere. The crew of Pathos 2 are memorable, and the conclusion is sure to strike up many debates between fans for years to come. It just happens to also be straddled with an annoying protagonist and dull enemy encounters that take up way too much of the experience. Instead of being something only hardcore fans of the horror genre can play, Soma is something I recommend to any fan of science fiction. Just know what you're getting into, and you'll have a great time. Which is why Soma gets an 8.5 out of 10. This is Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes.
I see a red door and I want it into black. I see the girls walk by dressed in their summer clothes.
You know that Zoe is my most true ally. Oh god, they're throwing grenades.
Yeah, and you've kept a very open thing with the community. You've shown a full content roadmap that everybody can see, and you've explained your plans for the game. How has the response been to that, and to the current build of the game that's out right now in the public?
Well, I'll take the second question first. So the response to the build and the game that's out there, the early access version that's out there now, has been really positive. We're hovering around 90% positive Steam reviews, which we're really pleased with, and it really inspires us to keep making those features and keep making things better. The open development policy has been something that we've embraced throughout the entire span of our development. We used to stream the game, playtest of the game, really, really early. Even when it was first person, we had some streams from way back when.